Welcome to the Zen of Reffing Roller Derby, Lesson 22, B, Game Structure Penalties, Part 2, Part 2. I'm Axis Esteval, the author of the training manual. I'm filming this on June 13th. Is it June 13th? I don't even know what day it is. Nope, June 14th. I lied. 2018. The content of this presentation is up to date as of this recording. Should this video become outdated or replaced by a newer version, I'll put a link on the screen to where you can find more information. As always, you can find the latest version of the full training manual at www.tinyearl.com/zenreffing. A quick disclaimer. The WFTDA, MRDA, and JRDA are not responsible for the content of the training manual or this presentation, nor do they make any claims as to the accuracy of their content. Another note, if you spot any errors or outdated information in this presentation, excuse me, please put a comment on YouTube explaining the issue and listing the time code. Now, Lesson 22, Game Structure Penalties, Part 2, Altering the Flow of the Game. Now, altering the flow of the game is basically for actions that disrupt, think of it as just sort of the feng shui of the game, the natural progression of the game. You know, we've got game clocks, we've got jam clocks. We want things to progress in an orderly way. But if something happens and a team pulls certain shenanigans that cause the game to be delayed to address the shenanigan, then a delay of game penalty or an interference penalty can be given for this. So let me back up a little bit. Let me start by saying that whenever possible, warnings should be used to fix a situation rather than issuing a penalty. It's one of the tenets of roller derby now, not as much in years past, but now, that game flow is a joint responsibility between the officials and the skaters. So the officials want to work with the teams and the skaters to make the game flow, but the skaters have certain obligations that go along with that. So for example, if we see a team at jam start which is not fielding a jammer, and it's 15 seconds till the jam begins, we're going to give them warning. Blue team, you have no jammer. And so that gives them a little bit of time to try to get somebody out there or throw the jammer cap to somebody so they can quickly be the jammer and hop behind the line. I mean, it gives them a chance to kind of fix this. We're not trying to just sit there and wait and they don't notice, and let's hope they don't notice, and 5 seconds and tweet and got them, and we can jump out and get a penalty. So that's really not what we want. We want to try to, let's resolve this before it becomes a problem. Just like the false starts, remember we talked about, that if we have to, we'll give a false start warning when the jam begins. But it's better before the jam begins if we could be saying, blue team, watch your position, or blue team, watch the line, or something. Same thing here. Let's work with the skaters to resolve problems before they reach a penalty level. Now, there are two types of delay of altering the flow of the game penalties. One is interference. The second is delay of game. WFTA has not formalized the difference between these penalty types, so you're not going to find anything in the rules or any other document specifically saying what the difference is between the two. So you will find referees that disagree and will call something one versus the other, but here's a generally accepted definition, and this is not a bad way to do it. Interference, by the way, which is the basic cue, these are illegal actions that interfere with the natural progression of the game, but do not halt the game clock. So the game itself is not delayed. The game clock is continuing on, but something interrupted the game. So, for example, a skater who successfully calls off the jam, well, they're not lead jammer. Well, that did have an impact on the game. It ended a jam early, but the game clock is still going. And again, you will find some referees that might want to call that as delay of game or something, but I wouldn't. I would just call that interference. Now, something on this, by the way, there's an exception to that particular illegal act, which is if an official is erroneously indicating the jammer has lead. Most commonly, this would be the jammer referee who's pointing at the skater. Okay, skater's being pointed at. That's the traditional way of signaling lead jammer. The skater then, if they're not lead jammer and just the official got confused and was pointing by accident and the skater calls off the jam, we're not going to penalize them because we made a mistake on this. This is, somewhat our fault. We gave them reason to believe that they were lead jammer, and we're not going to penalize them in this case for our mistake when they were making a good faith effort to follow the instructions we were giving. A lesser common and a more subtle way of doing this would be if the scoreboard is indicating lead jammer. I have met jammers that say they don't look at their jammer referee during a jam. They look, however, as they're skating around the track, they will glance at the scoreboard, and if they see their name flashing, or at least indicated they have lead in some fashion, then they know that they have lead and they can call it off. So that would be another way. The scoreboard operator in this case has indicated that they are lead. Again, it's a more subtle way of doing it than the referee, but it would certainly warrant not giving a penalty in this case. Another one, too many skaters. This achieving a competitive advantage, which cannot be rectified by ordering a skater off the track, generally requiring a jam to be called off early. So, case in point, blue team at the beginning of the jam has 5 blockers, and the 5th blocker, maybe they ran out of maybe the officials didn't notice, maybe they ran on the track right before jam start, but jam begins, and just by having 5 blockers, they just obliterate the other team's wall, and their jammer runs through and gets lead jammer. Well, we can, tell the extra skater to get off the track, but we're not going to be able to get rid of that competitive advantage. They got lead. That is a significant advantage in a jam. So in that case, we can call off the jam early and issue the team too many skaters penalty. Now, in doing so, the officials should feel a little bad that they didn't get it resolved beforehand, but sometimes it can't be. Sometimes the officials are distracted by something. Sometimes the skater came on at the last moment. And a little something to remember, if you remember all the way back, I think, to the lesson 3 or 4, around there, we were talking about verbal cues and such, and warnings. Officials do not issue warnings after the 5-second warning. So we will give warnings between jams, but as soon as that jam timer says 5 seconds, no more warnings. Because if we say too many skaters, and then 2 skaters jump off the track to try to solve that problem, and then the jam begins, now they're playing a skater short because we spoke up. If it's more than 5 seconds, then they just figure they've got more than 5 seconds to resolve it, and they can do so. So what constitutes, by the way, a competitive advantage during the jam? That is fairly open-ended. Lead jammer would be the most obvious one, but there could be others. It could be just something as simple as one team, by having too many blockers, is just really able to just lock down the other jammer or something. Even if the other jammer didn't get lead, but they were, they're able to go and they're coming around the track again, you realize, oh my goodness, it's 5 blockers, and that 5th blocker is helping to lock that other jammer down. If they're shutting down the other jammer, the first one's about to get points. That's a competitive advantage. So, okay, now we're going to talk about delay of game. This is a 2-star verbal cue, so you could use this instead of interference. Although, for the next set of penalties we're going to talk about, you would not be wrong to call them interference. That's just a more basic cue. Okay, delay of game I define as illegal actions that cause the game clock to be halted. And there are many of these in the game. So, number 1, failing to field a jammer at jam start. And by the way, we don't actually start the jam and then call the penalty. Ideally, what we want to do is they say 5 seconds, and you sit there and you count 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you stop the jam right before you stop the clock right before the jam would begin. So, because they've got 4 seconds, maybe they will get a jammer on the track. But both teams have an obligation to field a jammer. If one or both fails to field a jammer, that's a penalty that goes to the respective captain. Failing to field any blockers in a legal starting position at jam start. We need jammers. We need a blocker. We need at least 1 blocker from each team, because without that, we've got a problem. This can also run afoul of things like skaters all starting in a false start position. We're going to come back to that in a little bit. There's a special chart that I created that I'm going to update here, and we're going to talk about here. It talks about positioning at jam start. Failing to field a blocker in the penalty box queue in the correct position at jam start. Again, if a skater's in the queue, they must enter the next jam in that same position. So if they owe the penalty as blocker, they need to enter the next jam as blocker. If they owe the penalty as pivot, they need to enter the next jam as pivot. So if that person just wanders back off to the bench and doesn't come back to doesn't line up for the jam, that will be a penalty if we have to stop the clock to resolve that. Again, solve it with a warning if you can. Blue 2-7, you're required to be on the track for this jam. Yell that loud enough and you're going to get the person running or get the team very up in arms. But we want to resolve that if we can without a penalty. Another one, an injured skater lining up for a jam at jam start in which they are not allowed to participate. again, this is well, this one in particular is somewhat rare, but if a skater is injured, they're required to sit out for 3 jams. I believe, if my memory is serving me correctly, if skaters injured a second time in the half, a second time in the game, they're required to sit out for the remainder of that half. So, again, if they're not allowed to participate because of that prior injury, then if they line up for the jam at 29 seconds, we're gonna, or 29.9, we're gonna stop the clock, issue the penalty. Now, mind you, if the injury is such that there is a significant issue, like they really shouldn't be out there, they're cradling their arm and they're clearly in pain, you don't have to wait the 29. You can order them off the track. You can stop the clock beforehand. Don't get to that point. An injured, let's see, successfully requesting a timeout or official review when the team has none of that time remaining. And this is one of the few infractions that does require officiating error to issue. There aren't very many of these in the game, but there are a few. And if a team goes, requests a timeout, and the officials grant it, then you're like, oh, crap, they don't have any timeouts remaining. Well, in this particular case, you have an option. Instead of giving a penalty, if possible, charge them the other type of thing. So if they used all their timeouts, but they still have an official review, fine, charge them that. Normally, we don't have this option, but in this specific case, we can. Now, successfully requesting a timeout or official review by a non-captain and non-designated alternate. Remember, only this person wearing the C or the A can request the clock stoppage. So if somebody else on the team does, well, then that's a that's a penalty. They have successfully stopped the game clock, and they are not allowed to do that. Now, keep in mind that sometimes skaters will be going like this, but they're not signaling to an official. They're trying to signal to their captain, like yo, I need a timeout. I need a timeout. I need a official review this or something. So you should use a little judgment on who they're signaling to, and you can generally tell from the direction they're facing. But just be sure when you call it over there. If they are signaling to their captain and we call it by accident, then we're not going to issue the penalty. So because we failed to read their instructions correctly. In this particular case, by the way, docking the timeout or official review instead of issuing the penalty is not an option. Initially in the rules it was, and the teams basically spoke up and said, no, we don't want that. We'd rather take the penalty than burn our official review or burn a timeout when we don't want it, just because some nutnik, requested, some nutnik requested the timeout who wasn't supposed to do that. So they briefly discussed, whether the teams want the option that anybody on a team can request a timeout, and they were pretty much agreed, no, we want this to be left up to the team leadership. We don't want anyone to just be able to burn that. We want to use them for strategic purposes. So in this particular case, we will not dock them that because it wasn't being requested by someone that was allowed to. The reason that we are allowed to dock the other one for the other one I said about successfully requesting the timeout or official review and they have none remaining is simply because it was a designated person, the captain or alternate, who requested it, and because they were allowed to, and they do, then we will charge the other type of stoppage in that case. Now, all penalties for altering game flow always go to the captain, with 4 exceptions that I have here. Number 1, too many skaters. That's requiring the jam to be called off because of the competitive advantage, blah, blah, blah. That goes to the extra skater. Basically, think of this as these penalties are for the most responsible skater. So if you can figure out who the skater is, then issue it to one of them. If you're not sure, issue it to the closest skater. So again, too many skaters. Second, failing to field a skater in the penalty box queue in the correct position. That goes to that skater. We get them back into the jam for the next, and now they're going to have to serve an additional penalty for the infraction. Third, calling off the jam while not the lead jammer, which, by the way, is another penalty that requires some officiating error to do. But yeah, if the not lead jammer successfully calls it off, then they're going to take the penalty. Again, with the exception if we're pointing at them or something, or otherwise indicating that they are the jammer or lead jammer. And fourth, successfully calling for a timeout or official review by a non-captain and non-designated alternate. Then in that case, it goes to the person in question. If by some chance that's a bench staff person who cannot serve a penalty because they're not a skater in the game, then we would assess it to the captain. All right. Now, we've been talking about delay of game penalties, and frankly, there's no real footage to go along with this because there's just not much to look at. So instead, I'm going to show you this graphic. This graphic here I put together is 27 different possible ways of starting the jam. And it's going to cover false starts, out of position, and all sorts of... Anyway, lots of stuff here. This is as good a lesson to throw it in as any. So, number one. Got all skaters lined up in legal positions. This is legal. This is what we want a jam start to look like. Again, those blockers and pivots may be anywhere. You know, they may be right behind the pivot line, whatever. You know, but this is legal jam start. This is what you're typically going to get. Number two, legal. There's no penalty here, but neither of the out-of-bounds blockers. That's both the green one off to the side as well as the red one who's also touching the track there. But since they're touching out of bounds, even on the inside, not allowed to participate in the jam. Neither of the out-of-bounds blockers, and I have a typo, neither of the out-of-bounds blocker, okay, well, I'm going to fix that before I release this graphic publicly, may participate in the jam. Notify the jammer refs that both teams are a blocker short. Next, down here, number three, legal. Pivots may start touching the pivot line. That is entirely legal. Number four, legal. Both pivots may start touching the pivot line. So there are some people that are under the misbelief that the first pivot to get there somehow owns the pivot line. No, that is not correct. They may both start touching it. Number five, legal. Jammers may start touching the jammer line. Entirely acceptable. 6. False start warning to green blocker. Blockers may not start touching or ahead of the pivot line. Now remember, when we issue a false start warning, that green blocker now needs to yield. We had like a long conversation on what yielding means. But for now, just to know that they have to yield that advantage. Otherwise, they get a failure to yield penalty. All right, which, if I recall correctly, is illegal position. That has changed. So, all right. Number 7, false start warning to green pivot. Pivots may not start touching ahead of the pivot line. And just remember, by the way, ahead of that pivot line goes all the way around the track until you come back right up to just behind the jammer line. So it's like that big bulky area on the track. So 8, false start warning to red blocker right here, because blockers may not start touching on or behind the jammer line. The jammer line belongs to the jammers. Blockers and pivots may not touch it. 9, false start warning to red jammer. The line is fine. That red jammer can start on the line, but red jammer is touching ahead of the line. Jammers may not start touching ahead of the jammer line. 10. I had to draw a rather large P to make this one work. False start warnings to the 3 forward non-pivot blockers, the 2 red ones and the green one there, for starting ahead of the hips of the pivot touching the pivot line. Note, by the way, that the little green P did not get a false start warning. So even though blockers have to start behind the hips of a pivot who's touching the pivot line, the other pivot does not. They are exempt from that. In the olden days of Derby, they would have. You're going back like 3, 4, 5 years now. But for a couple of rules editions now, that has not been the case. 11. An illegal position penalty to red jammer for starting in a completely illegal starting position. Again, red jammer, if they're touching ahead of the jammer line, then they just get a warning. If they start completely touching ahead of that jammer line, now that's a penalty. 12. Illegal position penalties to both jammers for starting in an illegal starting position. You're probably never going to see this in your Derby career. Some of these, by the way, are a little rare, but once in a while they pop up, which is why I'm showing it to you. They both take illegal position penalties. 13. Illegal position penalties to both green blockers for starting in completely illegal starting positions. One, of course, is completely ahead of the pivot line. The other one completely behind the jammer line. So each of those would constitute a penalty. Now we're getting to the fun stuff here. 14. What do we do if all 4 green blockers, remember pivot is considered a form of blocker. When the pivot is, whether all 4 of them are touching the line, we do not start the jam. Delay of game penalty to green captain because no green blockers are in a legal starting position. At least one of those green blockers, and that includes the pivot, has to start legally. Otherwise, delay of game penalty. Basically, they've got 30 seconds to get one person in position. If this is the starting position, they intentionally put themselves in there, usually to create some sort of like no pack situation, some shenanigan. This is not what we want. That is not legal derby. We're going to issue it. We're not even going to start the jam. They're not going to get any advantage. We're going to issue a penalty, so their captain goes to the box. Then we continue. 15. Do not start the jam. Delay of game penalty to green captain, because again, no green blockers are in a legal starting position. So even, though they're, touching ahead of the line, that's not allowed. Just remember the pivot, is touching out of bounds. So the pivot and green blocker out of bounds. They cannot participate in the jam. These two green blockers are ahead of the line. So I'm not going to allow that. 16. We do not start the jam here either. Delay of game penalty to both captains for failing to field any jammers. Teams must field a jammer. If they do not, that's a penalty. We are not going to somehow view it cancels out. No, they both impacted the jam. They both can take the penalty for that. We're mean. We sometimes referees joke we get paid by the penalty. These are the penalties where we cash in when they do things like this. So 17. Do not start the jam. Delay of game penalty to green captain for fielding a fielded jammer. 18. Do not start the jam. Delay of game penalty to both captains for failing to field any jammers. Again, it makes no difference where the two were up here in number 16. If they were back on the bench, or if they went out to lunch, or wherever they are. Same thing. If they're out of bounds here, it makes no difference. If they're not in a legal starting position, by the way, in the box is a legal starting position, then we're going to give them a penalty. The one exception, by the way, on some of this out-of-bounds stuff is if, let's say, one jammer blocked the other one out of bounds, and then the first one we gave an early engaging penalty is, so, say red jammer got knocked out of bounds by the hit, and we sent green jammer to the box between jams, so green jammer's now on their way to the box. We will start the jam in this case, because we assume red jammer is going to step back in. Remember, we are admitting them to the jam. So, in which case, red captain would not get a penalty. Neither would green, actually, because remember, we are starting the jam. Green has a jammer. She's just on the way to the box at jam start. 19. Illegal position penalty to red blocker 1. Red blocker 1 has started in a completely illegal position. False start warning on red blocker number 2. So we can kind of combine and do things. We can give a penalty and a warning to different skaters. Number 20. Do not start the jam. 1 delay of game penalty to red captain for failing to field any skaters. Now, technically, you're talking 2 different penalties. 1 for not fielding any blockers, 1 for not fielding a jammer. We're not going to issue 2 penalties because the game was delayed only once by this action. So it's like hitting somebody in the back with your forearm and they fall over. It's 1 action, even though there are 2 infractions going on. So because it's 1 action, only 1 penalty. Same thing here in number 20. 21. Do not start the jam. Delay of game penalty to both captains. I'm not going to bother explaining on that one out. It's pretty obvious why. 22. Do not start the jam. Delay of game to both captains for failing to field any blockers. 23. Do not start the jam. Delay of game delay of game penalty to red captain for failing to field a jammer. Ignore all the false starts and illegal positions. They didn't matter because remember the jam did not begin. And by the way, we're getting into really screwy situations here. I don't know what would have gone wrong to create a situation like this. So, number 24. No one's on the track. 1 delay of game penalty to each captain for failing to field any skaters. So, again, they got to field something. Mind you, if something is happening here, the chances are that something has gone very wrong. For example, we've come back from an official timeout and, somebody forgot a roundup whistle or something, I don't know, something, or, something beginning of the second half. You should never, ever see this. Chances are something has gone very wrong with communication if neither team has put any skaters on the track. 25. Regular setup, but this time Green Jammer is accelerating at jam start. It's kind of an obscure rule because this very rarely happens. Jammers may not accelerate at jam start. Blockers can, jammers cannot. False start warning to Green Jammer for accelerating at jam start. 26. Warn the green team prior to 5-second pre-jam warning they are not fielding a jammer. Because, again, if they have no visible star, they're a blocker. And I don't mean visible, like no visible in terms of they clearly have the helmet cover in their hand, but just the star you can't see too well. It doesn't matter. We'll accept it in that factor. You can warn them between jams to show the star, and they just got to kind of reveal it. But if they don't have any kind of helmet cover, maybe it's stuffed down their pants or something like that, then you warn them between jams. Green team, you have no jammer. If they still don't fix it, do not start the jam because they have a blocker behind there. They don't have a jammer. They did not field a jammer, so we're not going to give the illegal position penalty to the blocker, but we are going to give a delay of game penalty to the captain because they did not field a jammer. This really shouldn't happen. On occasion it might. You're like, green team, you have no jammer. Green tip player reaches up, goes, oh crap, yells to their bench, throw me the cover, throw me the cover. Bench is looking around, where is it? Who's got, oh, you've got it, let me get it from you. And it's like, it's in the air. When the jam starts, boom, that's too bad. That has to be in the hand of that blocker. Even, by the way, if that star landed on the track, we still wouldn't allow it. That blocker has to have it in their hand or on their head at jam start. Like, if they sneezed and they dropped it out of their hand, fine. We'll accept that as, kind of no impact. But if it's in the air flying in, they were too late. 27. Prior to the 5-second pre-jam warning, in this one over here, warn red team they have too many skaters. Because, again, they got 5 blockers. You can, by the way, say too many blockers. That's fine, too. It doesn't matter. If not resolved by jam start, order an extra red skater off the track. So, again, you don't warn them after the 5-second warning because we don't want 2 of their skaters to instantly go, oh crap, and jump off the track because that would impact the game. So prior to the 5-second pre-jam warning, we'll tell them that red team, too many skaters, too many blockers. One goes. The one that goes back to the bench can obviously not be the one in the box. They cannot leave the box. This is the only one that is required to be in the jam. They can have any of the 4 others leave. Once the jam starts, then if they still have this many on the track, the referees would order the closest skater, the most responsible skater, the closest skater to the referee, order them off the track, would order someone off. Doesn't matter which one goes off, they just got to get one off the track. But generally speaking, you're going to order the closest, and you'll generally try not to order the pivot off the track in this case because they have a right to field a pivot. So that would impact the game more if we ordered the pivot off the track. We'd rather get one of the blockers off the track. 28. Legal. Begin the jam as normal. Notify the green jammer referee that red team has only fielded 3 blockers. That's fine. It's just the other blockers. That's a not point that person can get. Anyway, 28 situations here. I will put in the show notes where you can find this graphic once I fix the typo. So that way you can download it and you can study it because this is a very helpful graphic when learning how to start the jam. This is not all the possible bizarre jam starts, but this is the bulk of the major ones, so as well as some obscure ones. And just, a good way to kind of just learn the base concepts. So study it, learn it, because this is going to help you become a better referee. You can always trust, the head referee will get it. The more experienced refs will get it. But ultimately, you will become a more valuable referee if you can get it, because you spot these things, and you can say, yo, blue blocker over there, illegal positioning, whatever their number is, illegal position, you get them sent off to the box, or you can give the false start warning. The sooner you learn this stuff, the more valuable as a referee you will be, and the more credit you will get, and the more respect you will get from your fellow officials. So, all right, well, thanks for tuning in. And we will be back in lesson... What do I got next? I don't even know what I got next. I think we're back in 23 next on unsporting conduct. All right, thanks.